Now to the war on terrorism, a busy day for bombing runs over Afghanistan and a possible new threat against American interests overseas. NBC Jim Miklaszewski back at his post at the Pentagon for us again tonight. Jim.
Tom, this latest threat is against American targets in Yemen. And U.S. officials tell NBC News the word came over the weekend from some of those terrorist suspects rounded up in Afghanistan. Word of the terrorist threat came from al-Qaeda prisoners now being interrogated inside Afghanistan. The threat aimed at the American embassy in Yemen, where the USS Cole was attacked more than a year ago. The embassy was immediately closed to the public. Non-essential personnel and dependents were told they could evacuate. Other intelligence found in Afghanistan had already thwarted a bomb plot against U.S. military in Singapore.
We have a lot of information from a variety of sources, including the detainees.
The latest wave of 30 al-Qaeda and Taliban prisoners arrived at Guantanamo Bay today, bringing the total number in Cuba to 50. More intense interrogation of those prisoners should begin soon. American warplanes are still attacking what we now learn is Osama bin Laden's most elaborate cave complex in Afghanistan. Special forces on the ground have found more than 50 caves, covering 40 acres underground. But back home in the U.S., the Pentagon is now considering cutting back on those combat air patrols over American cities, launched after the September 11th attacks and intended to shoot down any airliner hijacked by a terrorist. The operation has put stress on the Air Force, requiring 250 planes, 11,000 personnel, at a cost of more than $300 million. And tonight, U.S. officials point to more terrorist threats overseas. Intelligence gathered in Afghanistan says there are threats against Americans in Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. But so far, they've apparently found no evidence in Afghanistan of any credible threats against targets here in the U.S. Tom?
And Jim, what about any evidence about the whereabouts of Osama bin Laden? What's the latest on that?
U.S. officials tell NBC News tonight that there's still no evidence that Osama bin Laden has fled the immediate area of Afghanistan. They think he's either inside Afghanistan or just across the border in a no-man's tribal land area of Pakistan. Tom?
All right, thanks very much. NBC's Jim Miklaszewski tonight. Secretary of State Powell leaves tonight for the war area, where he hopes to persuade India and Pakistan to back away from their military standoff over that terrorist attack on India's parliament. Over the weekend, Pakistani President Musharraf promised to crack down on terrorism. So I asked Powell if India is now prepared to back off.
Well, I think they have deployed and they're in forward assembly areas, but it isn't quite hair trigger, and that's what we want to keep from happening. We don't want it so much of a hair trigger that the slightest thing will set it off. President Musharraf gave a very important speech. He talked to the Pakistani people and said, we can no longer have extremism in our society or terrorism in our society. And he has acted on that statement by banning terrorist organizations, and I expect him to do more. He's arrested a large number of people, and so he is taking action.
But even with all of his control and authority, President Musharraf cannot control all of the terrorist groups. If there is another incident, do you think that the Indians are prepared to go nuclear against Pakistan?
I don't even envision anything such as a nuclear strike because of a terrorist incident. I think both sides realize that they are nuclear armed, and the last thing that can be allowed to happen in South Asia is a conflict that would result in the use of such weapons. And India has a policy of not using such weapons in the first instance. So we don't even want to contemplate or think about that.
Mr. Secretary, last month the State Department was saying that it believed that Iran was acting in a diplomatically responsible way in the war in Afghanistan. Now, in recent days, American national security officials are suggesting that Iran is being troublesome again, that it does not want a secular government in Afghanistan. Has Iran changed its stripes recently?
We have been in close contact with Iranian authorities. They were very helpful during the Bonn conference that set up the interim administration for Afghanistan. But we have seen some conduct on the part of some elements of the Iranian government that are troubling to us, and we're going to call it to their attention.
But what kind of pressure can you bring on Iran?
Well, I think we can talk to Iran. We can have a reasonable conversation with Iran. We can, I think, over time show it is in their interest not to take the kind of actions that will destabilize the government that they helped create in Bonn.
Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Tom.
Up next in depth tonight, the latest on the Enron mess and how it's rocking Houston from one end of that city to the other.
A lot of people just forgot about Diversified. They just became enchanted with the possibilities of how much money they can make in Enron.
New details tonight about who's getting stiffed and warnings ignored in the Enron collapse. Later, young Prince Harry played, and now he's paying big time. Bad publicity and even the police on his case. First, the nightly news question, what is Prince Harry's real first name? We'll have the answer a bit later.